So here we are once again at the railroad tracks, and we find ourselves dealing again with the trolley dilemma. Now, interestingly enough, the trolley dilemma has led to a whole field of study, jokingly referred to as trolleyology, and this is where some researchers in the mind sciences effectively use the trolley dilemma to figure out, what parts of the brain are actually driving moral judgments. So let me reintroduce you to the trolley dilemma. It is actually composed of two separate thought experiments, and the dilemma is, whether or not one is being inconsistent. So let's look at the two separate thought experiments. This first case, let's call this the switch case. So it's very simple. There's a runaway trolley and there's 5 people that are going to be killed by this runaway trolley if you do nothing. However, you are by a switch and you know that if you pull on it, the trolley will go down a side track, and yes, 1 person will die, but it is of course better than 5 people dying. So the math, it seems, would suggest, at least for a utilitarian, that you should pull the switch, right? In fact, when people are surveyed, they do in fact tend to say, yes, I would pull the switch. That seems to be the right thing to do. 2/3, depending actually on how you ask it, but roughly 2/3 usually say yes. That is the general situation there with the switch problem. Now, there's also the footbridge problem. So the footbridge is a little bit different. So it's still a runaway trolley and it's still 5 people who are going to die if you do nothing. But now there is a very large man standing in front of you on a footbridge, and if you push them over, yes, the man will die, but his bulk is such that it would actually slow down the trolley substantially, such that none of the other people would be harmed, right? And you can be assured that this will be the case. So obviously this particular image is, not terribly accurate, but the general idea here is that you can save those 5 people by pushing the fat man to his death, but thereby stopping the trolley. Now, this to a utilitarian, well, perhaps to, let's call him a naive utilitarian, would seem identical, right? I mean, it seems like it's the same sort of situation as the switch problem. It's just 5 lives. It's better to save 5 lives than the death of 1. So it's totally okay to push the fat man over. Of course, when queried, when asked, most people say no. They are alarmed at such a suggestion. They don't think it's okay to push the fat man to his death. Now, this is where the dilemma comes in. Question is, are we being inconsistent, right? Are consequences all that matter? Because if so, then just like when we pull the switch, we should also be willing to push the fat man over the bridge. Or maybe it's not just about consequences, right? So that is the dilemma. Why do most people think it's okay to pull the switch, but not to push the fat man over the bridge? Now, if it turns out to be something as simple as just physical contact, you don't want to actually physically do it, that seems like not a good enough reason. It seems like you're being inconsistent, right? So, why do people think that causing the death of 1 is okay in the switch case, but not in the footbridge case? Well, there is a gentleman who essentially has made his career, I would say at this point, trying to solve this puzzle, and his name is Joshua Green. Joshua Green is an interesting human because he has graduate studies both in philosophy and in neuroscience, right? So per his CV, he is definitely well-versed in multiple things. So Joshua Green has made a career of studying this dilemma using the tools of neuroscience, And his book, Moral Tribes, summarizes his findings. I do recommend Moral Tribes, by the way. It is very interesting. It is a little tough of a read. It's pretty standard popular science, but whenever you have to learn the parts of the brain and all that, it does get a little tough for people. In any case, I'll summarize sort of his main findings here. So what he essentially did is he took a bunch of people and shoved them into an fMRI machine. I'm sure shove is not the best word for that, but still put them in there and essentially asked them very tough moral questions. For example, he certainly asked them, of course, the trolley problem, which is, why they call it trolleyology. So that certainly was part of the battery of moral questions that subjects were asked, but also some problems that we haven't really talked about. For example, the crying baby dilemma. So the crying baby dilemma is, there's different versions of it, but it's roughly something like this. You are in Nazi-occupied France. You are Jewish. You are with other refugees, and there are Nazis outside the door, right? And they're checking around all the houses. So you are being very quiet. You have to be very quiet, otherwise you all get caught, and you all very likely get put to death. Which is how the Nazis dealt with, these kind of things. And just at that moment, just when the Nazis are out there listening and looking for any Jews that are hiding, your baby starts to cry. And of course, you cover his mouth, I guess, so that he isn't heard. But if you keep your hand there, well, you will eventually smother your own baby. He can't breathe. But if you take your hand off, of course, everyone gets caught and everyone dies. So let's just say it's 10 people, right? So what should you do? Should you smother your own baby such that one human dies, one baby dies? Or should you let your baby live long enough so that you all die? That's a tough question, right? And these are the kinds of questions that Joshua Green was asking the people inside the fMRI machine. So here are the results. Now, it is fascinating to think about the methodology and all that of Joshua Green's experiments, and he obviously goes into detail on that in his book and several of his articles. I am attaching one article to this lesson, so you can take a look at that. But I just need to give you, of course, the conclusion. So I'm going to skip a whole lot of stuff that I think is interesting and important, but I can only really here give the conclusions. So it looks like there are two types of judgments that we can make, right? There is the Kantian type judgments. Kantian type judgments, remember that Kant is known for his perfect duties. So don't lie, don't steal, don't kill. A lot of don't, right? Don't do this, don't do that. And there's also imperfect duties, right? But those are optional. The technical term is supererogative. But Kantian type judgments are don't do this, right? With an exclamation point, So that's Kantian type judgments. Utilitarian type judgments we've seen is all about the best consequences. There's always some kind of calculation being done. And what Joshua Green decided to do is to code these different moral conclusions, right? So if you decide to push the fat man over the footbridge, well, obviously you're thinking about consequences, right? So, maybe there's a couple of psychopaths that made their way into this study, but in general, you're looking at consequences. If you decide it's not okay to push the fat man over the bridge, well, then you're clearly thinking about, don't harm innocents, right? Don't kill. So that would be a Kantian type judgment, right? So to push the fat man over the bridge, that's a utilitarian type judgment. To not push the fat man to his death is a Kantian type judgment. It's not okay to use someone as a means to an end. So it turns out that if you code all these different moral dilemmas in this way, So there's a utilitarian answer and a Kantian answer. And by the way, these moral dilemmas were designed so that it's Kant versus the utilitarians. Here is what you find. Kantian type judgments, like don't kill the baby, showed greater activation of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or the VMPFC. While utilitarian type judgments, the greater good, showed greater activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. So there you see the DLPFC and the VMPFC right around where they are in your brain. And it is fascinating that it turns out during these kinds of moral dilemmas, you essentially see a lot of activity in these two regions. It's almost like they're fighting it out. Typical of Kant and the utilitarians, right? Their different brain parts are just fighting it out. You also see activation in the anterior cingulate cortex. So that's another thing, but that seems to not have really had an effect on what your ultimate decision is. In any case, when the DLPFC is more active, right, they're in the green, it turns out that you make utilitarian type judgments. But when the VMPFC is more active, in other words, that red region is the one that has greater activity, then you end up making Kantian type judgments. In other words, those are the brain parts that correspond to the different kinds of moral judgments that we make, according to Joshua Green. And depending on which one is more active, well, that's the kind of moral conclusion you come to. So you might be wondering what these parts of the brain are for. Well, the VMPFC is pretty clear what it does. It's pretty clear what they both do, but here is kind of the shocking part, the one part that I want to harp on for a second. The VMPFC is associated with emotional processing, literally modulating the activity of the evolutionarily older parts of the brain so that they can communicate with the newer parts. So the VMPFC connects to the amygdala. Essentially, it's kind of an honorary member of the limbic system, the more emotional regions of the brain. And apparently, per Pinker, its job, and Joshua Green, its job is to communicate with those older parts of the brain, the more emotional parts, and convert the activity into a language that can interact with the language of the newer cortical regions. So that's what it does. It basically allows the newer parts of the brain to communicate with the older parts of the brain. That's what the VMPFC does. That is fascinating because, well, think about it for a second. This leads us to conclude that Kantian type judgments are, surprisingly, largely emotional in nature. You would have thought that the cortical region, just pure reason, right, that's what he says, is how you arrive at deontological conclusions. But Joshua Green says no. When people actually arrive at deontological conclusions, when we actually peer inside their brain while they're making moral judgments, and they make deontological Kantian type conclusions, it's actually the emotional parts of the brain that are most active. That is mind-numbingly brain-shattering, right? That's this whole time we've been thinking that Kant is all about pure reason. Joshua Green says no, not at all. It's actually pure emotion. As a quick sidebar, you probably want to know what the DLPFC does, so I'll tell you. What function does our DLPFC have? Well, let me put it this way. It'd be the kind of thing that gets activated if you're at the airport and you're trying to figure out whether or not you should exchange your currency, now or later. The DLPFC calculates reward magnitude, reward probability, expected value, right? So if you're trying to figure out, should I change my pounds to dollars here, or should I wait till I get to, or should I wait till I get back to the U.S.? That's your DLPFC doing all the work, basically. Fascinating. Obviously, that is exactly what utilitarian reasoning is. You're just weighing pros and cons, or weighing, hedons, if you want to call it that, or pleasure against pain. Makes sense that that's exactly the part of the brain that actually drives Kantian or utilitarian type judgments. Anyway, so I do want to back up Joshua Green's work with other studies. And Valdezzolo and DeSteno have some pretty interesting studies, which they also summarize in their book. They do a whole lot more in their book, though. But there is this. So it looks like they played some clips for subjects. And they were apparently SNL clips. Now, I actually don't think SNL is terribly funny, but I guess they picked some good clips, right? And they were pretty funny. And here's what they found. If there is an emotionally positive stimulus prior to moral judgment, the judgment is more likely to be utilitarian. So apparently, if you can somehow get yourself in a good mood prior to filling out a moral questionnaire or doing some of these trolley problems or crying baby dilemma problems, you're more likely to be a utilitarian. Why? Well, stay tuned. I'll tell you in a second. Let me give you one more case study. Some people have lesions in their VMPFC. Lesions are, I'll just say, damage to the region in question. Although this is, what I'm about to say isn't true of Phineas Gage per se. Phineas Gage is just an example of someone with a lesion to their ventral medial prefrontal cortex. If you've never heard of Phineas Gage, a packing rod, shot through his cheek and out of his head, and he survived. And a nice little chunk of his prefrontal cortex got ripped off, and he essentially was never the same. Obviously, that was a long time ago, and Joshua Green and Valdezzolo and DeSteno, they did not study Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage has been dead for a long time. But they studied other people with lesions to their ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And as it turns out, if you have that part of your brain missing, the part of the brain that makes Kantian type judgments, well, obviously, if it's missing, you can't make Kantian type judgments. So they all tend to be more utilitarian. Oh, surprise, surprise. So it looks like, if you want to kind of summarize it, if you have that part of your brain, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and it's the one showing more activity, you're going to make Kantian type judgments. Or, on the other hand, if you have that part of the brain missing, or you somehow kind of short-circuit it by watching funny videos and you kind of shut it down a little bit, or you are just more of a dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex kind of person, you will make utilitarian type judgments, right? That's essentially the conclusion that they're arriving at. And this is, of course, no surprise to anyone who studies a little bit about psychopathy. I actually do enjoy reading about psychopaths. They are a very interesting group of people, in the worst possible way, obviously. But I do recommend the book The Wisdom of Psychopaths if you want to check that one out. And in any case, there is a correlation between psychopathy and emotional processing regions of the brain that are not functioning normally, right? So it seems like psychopaths, they do have feelings, right? But they certainly can't override their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It looks like they are able to make cold, calculated decisions. They can obviously kill with no remorse, right? So psychopaths are an example of how if your emotional processing parts of the brain aren't working well, then you're basically not going to follow Kantian maxims like don't kill, don't lie, don't steal. So there it is, evidence that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is how you make Kantian type judgments, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain that drives utilitarian type thinking.